Hello and welcome back to another installment of Gamesplaining, the rip-roaring podcast where I, Eric Crosby, attempt to explain a video game of Jake's choice uh, in as concise and coherent a way as possible. Jake, as you may recall, has played a sum total of 2 video games to completion in his entire life, and so our conversations are often, often quite enjoyable. Jake, take it away this week.
Well, I fully agree with that statement. And I want to introduce this week's video game by saying it's kind of a Hegelian, whatever, we'll leave it to the academics, synthesis of the prior 2 episodes, or at least 2 of the prior episodes we've recorded.
Interesting. Horror noir.
Well, so one of those involved survival horror,
Uh-huh.
and the other one involved a sort of what we'd call a period setting, I guess,
Sure.
with a kind of like very fucked up interiority to it.
Yeah.
Finding an analogy for this one is difficult because it's one word, but it's living lightning.
Living lightning.
Living lightning. Organic energy.
Bioshock?
That is correct.
We're going for the Bioshock, I see.
We are.
Bioshock in episode 3. Well. So, let me give you my priors on Bioshock. I have played Bioshock 1, but not to completion, and I have played Bioshock Infinite to completion. And it is not because I did not like Bioshock 1. I just simply never finished it for some reason. I don't know why. I got like halfway through and I just got playing other games. So what do you know about Bioshock? What are your priors on this, Jake?
Well, so you described when we were talking about survival horror, I think shortly after we recorded the earlier episode about Resident Evil.
Sure.
You used Bioshock as an example, kind of offhand.
Yes.
I didn't know that beforehand. What I know about Bioshock is mainly a familiarity with a lot of the literature and history it's based on, specifically the literature the first game is based on and the history the second game is based on.
Yeah.
And I'm very interested in both of those things because I think they're very interesting workings as I'm aware. I don't know what the experience of the game is, although the survival horror element I didn't legitimately understand. I know it looks beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Very Art Deco, which is an aesthetic I like. And if we get into it, it really does fit the literature it's based on.
Yeah.
Which is...
yeah, the idealism. Yeah.
Well, very specifically the writings of Ayn Rand.
Yeah, exactly.
And that kind of affects what I'm interested in about it, because I'm really interested in how the first game plays on the concept of greatness.
Mm-hmm.
And I can explain why, but I guess that I want to start with that first question.
Sure. So you're asking how does the game kind of talk about great men? Is that the idea?
I think the first way to say it is through the gameplay. So how are you rewarded?
Yeah. Gameplay in Bioshock. So Bioshock is kind of in the immersive sim genre. It's actually a spiritual successor to a game called System Shock. So System Shock was a very similar game. This was a game that took place on an abandoned space station where the player, they have a set of tools and they're discovering what went wrong on this space station and learning about the rogue AI that took it over, that kind of thing. And so Bioshock was originally intended as a spiritual successor to this game, hence the shock in both of the titles. And so Bioshock, you are exploring a city called Rapture, an underwater city, as you said, very Art Deco inspired. And this city, Rapture, was supposed to be like a Randian utopia, essentially. But you go there after the fall, after it's all gone to hell. There's like people using, they're like psychic drugs, basically. And so there's like people who are hopped up on these psychic drugs running around using psychic powers that like send wasps out of their bodies and stuff like that.
Oh.
And so, yeah, the experience of playing the game is basically exploring this abandoned city. You're kind of left to wander around Rapture and find out what happened by discovering the little stories here and there. So there's audio logs you can discover, text, that kind of stuff. You're mostly reading and listening to what dead people left behind, essentially. And in gameplay, it's an immersive sim, so you have powers like the enemies. You have like psychic powers, and you can shoot guns at them. You can do hacking of various kinds, that sort of thing.
And this is an artist's colony, then?
Yeah, it's kind of like, I don't know if it's specifically just for artists. Like Rapture is kind of like where your rich people would go to escape the real world and like try to build a new world. Essentially, it's the utopia.
It's Galt's Gulch from Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, and I guess so. Following through on that, there's these psychic drugs. I'm assuming you can take these drugs and get powers. I'm assuming that.
absolutely. Yeah, that's a big part of the core gameplay is unlocking these powers.
And is there like so I'm kind of thinking of like the sanity meters you see in these newfangled games we're playing these days. Does there because these people are off their heads on the drugs,
Yeah, yeah.
on the psychic drugs. I sound like my grandfather talking about psilocybin.
You do not, as far as I know, experience adverse effects from gaining the powers. However, the game does track your moral choices, which is based on the Little Sisters, which are these characters that have Adam. Adam being the kind of psychic fluid lifeblood stuff that the Little Sisters, which are like bioengineered little baby children, they have all this Adam inside their body. So you can harvest them or you can save them. And if you save them, the game will track that and it will it will reward you with a better ending, essentially.
So first question is there an Eve in the picture?
I can't. Oh yeah, there is. Yes.
Oh, there actually is. Okay.
Eve is the stuff that you use to cast your psychic spells.
Oh, okay. Makes sense.
It's like your mana meter.
So you got Adam and Eve. Okay.
Yeah.
And is it like a boss thing then? How do you like? Is there a plot?
Yeah. So the Little Sisters are guarded over by the Big Daddies, which are the kind of title. Like you'll see them on the box art. The big guys in the diving suits. They're like these genetically modified creatures, essentially. They are human, but they like don't really have much of their personality left, and they are all mind controlled. And yeah, they guard over the Little Sisters. That's their job.
For your enemies or for who?
Yeah, for Andrew Ryan, who's the guy who runs Rapture, basically.
This is the character who I was so whose wiki page I think I read. Now he's Russian, yeah,
I don't recall.
Belarusian, something like that.
Probably.
Is with the AR initials.
Yeah, yeah.
Hates. Interesting. Yeah. I don't think that's a reference at all to anything. Nothing at all.
Yeah, Andrew Ryan. Randrew Ryan. Yeah.
Is he a libidinous fellow? Is he a randy boy?
I don't recall. As I said, I stopped playing halfway through, so I don't remember.
The reason I ask is that Ayn Rand was a very sexually active person, a lot more than most of her adherents. There's a book about it called The Passion of Ayn Rand that is an interesting read.
Yeah.
And the reason I ask about greatness a bit, because I know that, so Rapture is Galt's Gulch then, which is,
yeah.
in Atlas Shrugged, which is, I think, probably her most famous book, which is a sci-fi book. There is a intentional community created by a character named John Galt, which is called Galt's Gulch. I think it's somewhere in Colorado. And it's a place for essentially the super people, like the artists and the creators and the innovators of society, to congregate away from, I think Rand explicitly says collectivism about 100 times, more than 100
yep.
throughout the book. And they do this to essentially wait out the collapse of civilization, which is, spoiler, how the book ends. And the optimistic end is them sort of divvying up the world between them at the last leftover. The thing about greatness, I think, is very interesting to see the way the literature that and a lot of Ayn Rand's writing is used. Because I think there's a lot of thought that it's about liberty, and I don't think it is. It's about greatness. That's, I think, a core conceit there, because I think that the way Rand measures her heroes is through freedom from accountability, more or less. Like, it's very Nietzschean and it's very Carlylean in that way. But the thing that drives a lot of it, and the thing I think that the game seems to be playing out, because Andrew Ryan puts this idea into reality and it seems to go very badly. I don't know how long the Rapture exists.
Oh, it's not long. I think at maximum it's a few decades. I don't think it's very long at all, though. It's a few years, I think.
The kind of greatness that is in all of Rand's books, and I think part and parcel of what her heroes are made of, is extremely combative.
Yeah.
And it's extremely it's necessarily bottom heavy.
How do you mean?
Well, so the great person idea, I would say great man, and I think Rand would probably use the same terminology, but
Yeah. Yeah.
that idea necessarily implies being able to effectively impose your will, like by subjugating the vast majority of people around you.
Yes, which in Bioshock, Andrew Ryan can literally do. He can literally mind control people.
Is this with is there a phrase for this?
Yes, yes. Would you kindly is the phrase.
Ah,
Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. That's the quote.
interesting.
Yeah.
And what does he use that to do? Like, is that how you get missions in the game?
Yes. Yeah. Partially.
So he's the villain then.
Yes. So Andrew Ryan is your main villain in the game, and he's very much like your Randian hero, right? Like he, there's statues of him all over the city. He's revered as this great mind, this architect of a truly individualist utopia, and yet he doesn't seem to act according to his own beliefs, right? Because he believes in the absolute power of the free market. And yet he controls other people, right? He dominates them literally through mind
He
control.
believes in free will, but he employs mind control.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's such a fucking yeah. You get what I'm getting at.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the joke you could say about like a lot of Rand's like contemporary followers in the Austrian school, but it's the thing that really does kind of permeate her literature. Is again, it is in a very certain sense of freedom, but it is very much only freedom for those who are capable. Because a big part of her books, I think a big part of the emotional power her books genuinely do have, is the level of contempt Ayn Rand is able to, she's dead, but it is, I mean, Rand herself is very fond of the word parasite.
Yeah.
For essentially anybody who shows this kind of a very specific, like not specific, but very multifaceted variety of weakness.
Yeah, people who can't turn the wheels of industry basically are not valued, up to and including the disabled, the poor, the sick.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, like her universe just kind of excludes a lot of them. Like
Yeah.
there are no, for example, disabled people in Rand's books
Yeah, I
unless
don't think she imagines they have a place in her ideal society.
there's two ways they fit in. One is as this sort of like deformed but guileful figure,
Mm.
and the other one is as someone who is able to, again, through sheer force of will, overcome. And I don't know if either one of those things are there because I don't think she really cared that much. That wasn't
Yeah.
what they were about.
Yeah.
But part of this is that these villains are very like her villains, who I don't know if they're present in Bioshock.
Mm.
Like her villains are people like Ellsworth II in the Fountainhead, who's the villain of Fountainhead. He's an editorial columnist.
Yeah.
A sort of I don't know who's a send up of, but he's sort of I guess if he was a Brit, he'd be a Fabian. But like she's able to give these villains like very sinister speeches about destroying great or beautiful things
Yeah.
because they can. Like
Yeah.
and the villains of Atlas Shrugged transparently believe.
Yeah, that's something that BioShock leans into because it's in the game one of the main characters, Atlas. It was like a leader of the revolutionary movement in Rapture. That was like a more collectivist worker movement, basically.
Oh, there's a character named Atlas.
Yeah, yeah. And Andrew Ryan suggests that these people are trying to destroy something beautiful, right? That's his whole argument for why people should hate the revolutionaries. One, because they're trying to destroy the utopia that they built, but two, because Rapture itself is a beautiful place. It's Rapture, the city, is a work of art, essentially. And he portrays Atlas as having this mission to destroy what is beautiful,
of which he is the author too.
Yes, yeah.
And that's like the Fountain. Atlas Shrugged is less about that, but the Fountainhead is.
Yeah.
The Fountainhead is a book that, well, it's about architecture. I should have asked Eric. Sorry, I should have asked at the beginning. Have you read these or not?
I haven't. No, I've never read any Rand. Because I object to her philosophy so much that I didn't want to give her the time of day. I'm not as much a person who feels like I want to know my enemies,
So There are 3 novels she wrote of note, and there's 1 book of essays. And so the novels are We the Living, which was, I think, if not her first novel, it's the first one I know. It's her best written, probably not, maybe not, yeah, best evenly written character study, I guess. It's autobiographical. It's also a little more forgettable.
Right.
Fountainhead comes after that, which is the archetype of what she would create. And then Atlas Shrugged is the prog rock opera of that.
Okay.
Because Atlas Shrugged is also a science fiction novel.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a really weird choice of science fiction novel, but The Fountainhead is the best example of it, because The Fountainhead is about authorship in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's because The Fountainhead is about an architect named Howard Rourke. There's another architect who goes to school with him named Peter Keating, and Howard Rourke is, of course, this very bluff, take no shit individualist. Very like I say individualist. I'm not using buzzword here. That is very deliberately what he is designed to be. Like he is the very much comparators that Ayn Rand designs her protagonists in The Fountainhead and then in Atlas Shrugged is Ubermensch, like in a very Nietzschean sense.
Mm-hmm.
And the contrast to him is Peter Keating, who is from point a kind of contemptible character, because he's a kind of sniveling, kind of desperate to please. Like I guess he's kind of the pencil-neck with mommy issues.
Right.
And that kind of weakness comes in, and then the villain of that one is Ellsworth Toohey, who again I mentioned is like this vaguely socialist gossip columnist.
Yeah.
Not gossip columnist, like editorial columnist. And the interplay between those 3 characters, and there's also a very weird romance in it. All of her romances are really, really weird.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ask about that in Bioshock, if there's any kind of romantic element.
Not as much in 1, but there is an Infinite, yeah.
Okay, so Infinite's a different thing.
Very much, yeah.
Yeah, because I know the history about that, but I don't know what the thing is there.
We should also at some point talk about the development of these games, because it's actually a really interesting story. But we'll get to that.
Oh,
Sorry.
sure, yeah, okay. So we'll get around to that pretty shortly. So, and it's like it's Dominique is his heroine. Rand straight up described Dominique as like herself, but with a more abrasive personality. Which, knowing what I know about Ayn Rand's biography, is a very interesting descriptor, because it is probably true, but there's no way around this. There are sex scenes in both of those books that are arguably rape scenes. They're right on the edge. Like it's right there, and it would fit with her conception of what her ideal man, I guess, would both, I don't know about want to do, but be capable of doing. And there's a certain degree to where being able to do it is this pure act of strength. Because the thing about authorship, the thing I wanted to circle around to just kind of close that one, because we're talking about Andrew Ryan taking pride in the city.
Yes.
Howard Rourke at the end of The Fountainhead, I'm spoiling these books. At the end of The Fountainhead, so there's a building he builds that is bastardized by Peter Keating. And I do want to point out that his architecture style is brutalist. It's explicitly extremely it is literally the complaint about skyscrapers being phallic. That's the point. Which is also a huge complaint about like the vertical structures of Art Deco, which I imagine is how Rapture looks.
Yes, yeah, very much so. You got some very phallic buildings in Rapture.
Now, just from what I've this images I've seen, those are like kind of gilded, right? Like they're very fancy. Yeah. Howard Rourke would think that's no.
Yeah.
You gotta have just a striking building. You gotta have a finger penetrating the sky.
Yeah.
No, it's not. It's not sexual. Kind of sexual. They make it weird. They make it really weird, because Keating gets, I guess, some ability to create add-ons that are apparently distasteful. Howard Rourke's response to this is to blow up the building. Yeah. And in the trial, he gets an 8-page speech.
Oh, that's the famous, yeah.
No, it is not.
Oh, that's not the famous one? Okay.
Atlas Shrugged, which is, I think, close to 200 pages.
Okay, I see.
That is a radio broadcast described as being, I think, an hour long in the book, and it takes like 2 to read.
Maybe if you read it like a 50s radio announcer, the continental accent reading really fast, maybe that's what Maybe that's how you do it in an hour.
And so, as they say, in conclusion, that's why we should have legal child labor. Here's
Yeah.
how it
Yeah, don't violate the NAP.
Oh, no, Ayn Rand would actually probably fund violating the NAP. I think Ayn Rand would probably think the NAP is a little bullshit.
Yeah, probably.
Ayn Rand's not a libertarian. She's a Carlylean and a Nietzschean before
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And the thing about Howard Rourke's authorship, and I think this is the specific point of the book, is this ability, like if you create something, you have this coterminous right and ability. I mean, I guess one kind of is the other in this universe to destroy it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what makes you a great man.
Yeah.
And given what are you trying to destroy Rapture? If Andrew Ryan's the villain and he's the author, are you trying to destroy Rapture?
Essentially, yeah. Ryan already kind of did, though. Basically, his solution to the revolution was this mind control plan. The "Would you kindly?" It was every single person in Rapture was able to be mind controlled by this phrase, basically. And so Ryan kind of already did destroy his own city before you even get there.
Okay.
I similarly to what you were just describing, where Rourke just destroys the building, right? It's the same kind of thing. And one thing I wanted to touch on, I think it's very interesting that the villain, or at least what seems like the villain of that story, the Keating character.
Tui would be the villain. Keating's
Okay,
kind of like the secondary antagonist.
sure.
He's just a conformist and a social climber. I mean, those are the two descriptors you'll see about him. Like
I see.
he's just kind of pathetic. I feel like Ayn Rand hates him more than Tui, just
Yeah.
because Ayn Rand's biggest contempt is for weakness.
Well, that's what I wanted to touch on was the fact that he's a journalist. I think is important because a lot of this Randian stuff gets down to hatred of critics, right? Like journalists and critics as being like absolute abscesses of society, right? Particularly when it comes to journalism, we see it in these games. We see it in real life when people see critics, talking about art and, they say they don't like it or whatever, then people say, oh, well, what would you know? You can't create it, right? And it's the same thing with anybody who dares say ill about Rapture or about this brutalist architecture you're talking about in the book, right? Anyone who dares speak ill of it, they're just showing their weakness because they're just a critic. They can't build it themselves, It seems like that's a running theme throughout this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's also like one of the ones where we obviously have to get here because it is kind of a specter haunting the discussion. But like Rand was not a fascist in a very real sense.
Mm.
Like in a doctrinal sense, she was not. But there's a way that there are characteristics that I think there's a great Umberto Eco essay called Fascism
Mm-hmm.
that I think outlines a very strong characteristic to the precursor ideas
Yeah.
of fascism and the ways it will reinvent itself, and also the ways it's syncretic to other ideas. And I think Rand, because of her continuity with Nietzsche and with, I would say, Thomas Carlyle in particular, really does kind of exemplify this.
Mm-hmm.
There's a hatred of criticism and a inability, like a contempt and hatred of the concept of criticism, and to a certain extent the concept of critical thinking.
Yeah.
It's not always that black and white. It's always very complex in reality.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very common one because it becomes the cult of action. And the thing about Ayn Rand is that there's a unique, I would describe it as a kind of joy. I think one talent that Ayn Rand has that very few propagandists have is her genuine ability to create a sense of, it's extraordinarily cruel joy, but there is an exhilaration at certain points in the book. Largely the kind of exhilaration is the flip side of rage, but it's a powerful one. It's a powerful feeling. I think she was very sympathetic to romanticism, capital R romanticism, as again, like there's the through line there to Nietzsche, of course, and to aspects of that in different people today. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but there is a way where what that will create is a sort of violent conflict within this creation, and it makes authorship inherently violent.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking when we talk about Rapture, and maybe when we talk about the experience of the game itself, depending on how horrifying or violent it is to play.
Very. I would say it's very violent.
Is it like bloody? Like, do you like?
Oh yeah, it's gory. Yeah, the act of using the powers is body horror. Like they have stuff where like your arm turns into a swarm of hornets, right? and it's you're using your body to cast these spells. It's very much body horror.
Ugh.
Maybe not anything as bad as I make it sound, like visually, but just due to the limitations of the graphics of the time, not due to a lack of horror in concept. You know?
God, I hate hornets.
Yeah, yeah. It's pretty freaky.
Apropos of the graphics limitations, you mentioned the development history.
Yes,
Let's sort of see into that. What's
I wanted to quickly go into that because there's an interesting through line there with the whole great person thing. That I just read the excellent book Press Reset by Jason Schreier, which I would recommend to you, Jake, and to anyone listening. It's a very, very great, insightful look into the games industry, and a large part of the book covers the development of Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite, and how a lot of the troubles with the game's development were due to essentially it being a game led by an auteur, which is something that sometimes happens in the video game world. That there's some companies and some people like Hideki Kamiya, people like Hideo Kojima, they're like auteurs where their singular vision drives a game because people trust them to do what's right. And so in the case of Bioshock, the game was kind of directed by this guy, Ken Levine. But apparently during development, he was like extremely angry. He would have these outbursts all the time, you know, just stuff like this. And like people said they trusted in his vision. From what I gathered from the developer interviews in this book, is that they trusted in Ken Levine's vision for the game, and they did truly believe he would create a great game in the end. But a lot of time was wasted by the fact that he would just come in and say, "I hate this," and throw it all out, or just like scream at people and tell them that their work was terrible and to start over, that kind of thing. And it's very funny to me, and fun, like darkly funny, you know, that the game is such a critique of great man theory, and yet the game itself had this guy basically asserting his will over his developers, right? Just like coming in, yelling at them, you know, wanted it to be his vision. And then he essentially fired everybody because he wanted to work with a smaller team. Like he just did not seem to have a regard for the lives he would be changing, you know? And it's just wild to me. I recommend reading that book. The stories that people tell about him are bizarre.
that seems a bit like the Disaster Artist. I mean, say what you want about the Room, it is a very pure auteur work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, was there anything else you wanted to know about Bioshock 1 specifically? Because I do want to talk about Infinite.
I want
'Cause
to
I
move
think
on to Infinite, and I know less about it. I know there's time travel.
there is, yeah, that's a large part of it.
I tend not to like. Time travel kind of weirds me out a little bit.
I agree. I think time travel ruins most stories that it takes that it happens in, basically.
And I know that instead of being underground and underwater, the city is in the clouds,
Yes.
which is very much reminds me of Laputa from Castle in the Sky, and if we go back farther, Gulliver's Travels. And this city is run by Anthony Comstock.
Comstock, yep.
Is it actually Anthony Comstock?
It's Zachary Comstock in Bioshock.
Oh, okay. It's supposed to be Anthony Comstock.
Yeah.
Anthony Comstock is a historical figure. He's described as an anti-vice activist, which means he was a man whose official job was to suppress fun uh, for most everybody in the tri-state area and in large part several nations. He was a book burner. He was a core enemy of reproductive autonomy through
Mm.
history. Through the narrow part of it through which he was alive, but a really fantastic one. And it's really amazing when, I mean, like, I guess there is other through lines, but you can find people from H.L. Mencken to Emma Goldman who think Anthony Comstock was a piece of shit, and they're probably correct.
Hmm.
Well, no, I would say, I mean, I have very little enthusiasm for Comstock, but like Comstock's world is a different kind of dystopia from the one that Rand would propose. I mean, mostly because Rand was a writer. I mean, people have tried to create a literal Galt Gulch many times. I mean, if you want to know what Galt Gulch would actually look like, what a lot of this would actually look like, I mean, like you can still travel to Somalia, but Anthony Comstock's variety of repression was pretty like I don't want to say common, but like through the Victorian period, like there were not a lot. There were a lot of Comstocks around in very high places.
Yeah.
I think Comstock's personal, the fact that he really did seem like a fucking peeping tom, because he had the thing where he was like, I mean, H.L. Mencken was like, say what you want about H.L. Mencken, but he was very good at taking the piss out of these fellas. And with Comstock, he basically figured that he's just going through all of your mail to find anything that might at all be obscene, and he's totally not enjoying this. He was a postal service. He was a postal inspector. There's a bit of a stopped clock bit where he was anti, he cracked down as well on quack medicine, which what I know about food and medicine adulteration in the Victorian period. I mean, good relative to some of the other abuses. The thing about Comstock is that I feel that this, as I'm given to understand, this is essentially a theocratic ethnostate, specifically a Christian ethnostate in the clouds,
Yes.
which is absolutely a place Anthony Comstock would have wanted to live in.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because I was having trouble drawing a through line between the real Comstock and the one from the game. But you're right. The religious ethno state aspect, very much a no fun allowed kind of thing. They're all about what do you call it? Suppressing sin. What they
Violence, like this violently segregated society.
Yeah. Yeah. So the thing with Infinite that I think is very interesting to me is that Bioshock, the first, just Bioshock 1, I think ultimately does a really good job at naming its target and at giving a critique that is solid, like especially for a video game. Video games critiquing politics usually are not that great. I look at something like Far Cry 5, which kind of names its target but refuses to say anything very certain about it. Whereas in Bioshock, like it names its target and it really goes deep on making sure the analysis, the critique hits home. Whereas Infinite has a very weird problem where it ends up being kind of centrist about the whole thing. Because its plot is so convoluted and they tried to put in so many twists that they end up undercutting any actual critique they made. I think of the revolutionary movement in Infinite, which is called the Vox Populi. You see them like they're standing up against the ethno state, right? And obviously stand up against the ethno state. Like they're a violent revolution against people who were violently killing blacks in the streets, basically, which is fair enough. But then these revolutionaries turn out to also be evil later on in the game. Like they reveal that they're just killing civilians in the streets now. This kind of thing, and it kind of tries to both sides it a bit, which is really strange. It takes this angle of like everybody's evil in this situation, which when you're talking about resisting a theocratic ethnostate, probably not the angle you want to go for, Ken.
Maybe there's a part of that where I think about when we're talking about the context Anthony Comstock existed in.
Mm-hmm.
Like a big one of his enemies. I mean, Comstock and Woodrow Wilson are on one side of this, and like people like Emma Goldman are on the other. And I think Emma Goldman was like, by virtue of being a really good writer, kind of comes out on top there. There's a very definite aspect where I do think, like, if you did have a point where it came to actual violence, we'd have a won't get fooled again situation. When you think about the history of, I would suppose, like, I mean, like, to an extent, they did do that. I mean, that was what, actually, I'm kind of apropos of this. This is something that'll come up if we ever do an Other Worlds episode. Outer Worlds episode?
Outer Worlds,
that
yeah.
one. Yeah, but, like, they did do direct action. That's why McKinley never finished his term. Now, McKinley was a shithead and kind of had it coming. But there's an aspect of that where I do see, if you're trying to do the experience of a violent revolution and it just ends up with a lot of people dying, that tends to be historically accurate.
Historically accurate, maybe, but I think in the context of a piece of art which is trying to put forward a critique of something, both sidesing the issue is, I think, ultimately deflates any actual credulity that the work has.
And with this one, is the point of it essentially, because I'm assuming you can travel back in time to change these events in a fundamental way. Is
Yeah,
the point of it
it's
don't try to do that?
the time travel thing's weird. It basically, at the end of the game, what it amounts to is that your protagonist is Comstock from the past. Basically, the person you're
Oh,
playing as, Booker, becomes Comstock in his future,
what a twist!
and so it becomes the like traveling back in time to kill baby Hitler kind of thing. Basically, it's that
And it's like,
level of weird twists. And the main the companion character Elizabeth, who I'm sure you've seen screenshots of on the internet. Elizabeth is your daughter. She's Comstock / Booker's daughter, and she's like this like super magically powered being, and she is the reason that you can time travel.
she's missing a finger.
I don't remember,
Oh, what?
but yeah, she can travel through time and space.
I see.
The one thing that I do think is cool about Bioshock Infinite is that it sets up a kind of cinematic universe whereby you end up seeing Rapture, and you travel to this dimension that's like all these lighthouses, and there's this line that's like it's a cycle. There's always a leader. There's always a city. There's always a man to stop him. That kind of thing, which is a neat way to tell that story, right? To have it be a kind of cyclical thing. There's always a great man that rises up, and then there's always someone to stop him.
Is that the through line between the games? Then they're kind of an anthology style.
Exactly. That's the idea.
Oh,
So Bioshock 4 is in development now, actually. So I'm interested to see where that goes, because I don't think it'll be a sequel to the Rapture games or to Infinite. I think it'll be something completely new.
that's very interesting. Yeah,
And hopefully
that's
it's
an
better than
excellent.
Infinite, because Infinite again, yeah, does not hit the mark. I think with its critique.
Is the same gameplay as like the first one? Like your arm turns into a swarm of
Yeah,
that's at any point, or
Infinite has less of the body horror stuff. It's very much supposed to look beautiful, whereas Rapture is decaying by the time you get to it. Where you are in Columbia, which is the city in Infinite, is still very beautiful when you get there. Like it's not destroyed or anything until later on. So you get a lot more of this like beautiful. What do you call it? I'm thinking of like the Rocketeer and stuff like that. It's like that. It's
steampunk.
the very beautiful steampunky city. And you can like, there's a lot more movement in Bioshock Infinite. You can like grapple on these like skyline things that you can move around a lot
Oh,
and see a lot of stuff. So that stuff's all cool. The actual playing of the game is not survival horror like the first one in any way. It's much more of just a straightforward shooter, which again is a reason why I think it doesn't work as well. Part of the reason that the first Bioshock is so good is because it's a lot of dread. As you're exploring Rapture, there's always the tension. You hear the Big Daddy, this huge guy in this diving suit, right, is like stomping around in the distance, and he's somewhere, but you're not sure where. And in Infinite, they try to do that, but it's not as well done.
and I imagine like in the ruins of Rapture. I just looked up a picture of the inside of it. And I see what they're doing because there's like this like there's like because this is underwater, right?
Hmm.
So there's like this sea waste a little bit, and then there's like this like mold and
Yeah,
blood,
yeah,
and this like it's a really grubby, wasted, brutal, like again like this very high-minded vision brought to a very brutal conclusion.
exactly.
There's a deep tragedy in that.
Yeah, I think something that's interesting. My next YouTube video at the time of this recording is about Prey, and Prey I actually think of as being a Bioshock game. It's not made by the same studio. It's made by Arcane, who made the Dishonored games. Prey is it's very similar to Bioshock. You're exploring an Art Deco like corporate utopia that has been brought to its knees by some existential threat, right?
Ah,
It has a lot of these same themes, but done in a very different way. So it's interesting that you chose this one for this episode, because kind of this Bioshocky stuff has been on my mind.
there you go. I'm glad to hear of it. It's an interesting thing where I'm like, because I think a bit about the place Ayn Rand inhabits in. I think she's known better for her philosophy than for her literature,
Hmm.
which is interesting because her philosophy is not well read, but her literature is the way that it's conveyed.
Yeah,
Like there's, what is it? It's On the Virtue of Selfishness. I think it's either an essay or the essay collection, which is a lot of them. I think they primarily deal with romanticism, or is that an essay in the one on romanticism? I can't recall. And I have a device in front of me that gives me access to infinite information. So let me just correct that in a moment. But oh bloody hell! The point being this, like Ayn Rand is in the academy, I think, and I think a lot outside of it. There's a lot of intent to disregard her philosophy
Yeah.
and her work with it. And I think that there's a reason that that's made. That there's a reason to do that based on like not believing the tenets of it, because it is, the work is an ideological work. Like in Atlas Shrugged, it's a very literally utopian ideological work at the end of it, but by a lot of roundabouts. But it is that it's an eschatological work where at the end of it, the world collapses, and then her chosen people, these capital R romantic businessmen and artists, rebuild it according to what they want. They get pure authorship over, I guess, the world. Frankly, the world itself, which is interesting because there's a moment in The Fountainhead where Ellsworth Toohey confesses to wanting world domination at one point in a moment of honesty.
It's generally a bad look.
I don't know, who of us has not at one point said to someone, buddy, as I'm saying, it's world domination. It's a pretty good plan. But look, have you thought about multi-world domination? You can shoot a car into space. All I'm saying is, you got to get some different worlds. You got to get your value worlds, and then you got to dominate those. And you know what? Then you do. Then you trade up. You always be scheming. You know what I mean? And that is how you get galactic domination. Stay with me, because this is how you deal with the sun burning out in a few thousand years. So we've got to have a long-term plan for this one. I got some graphs. Do you want to see my graphs? That notwithstanding, I think the one thing about Ayn Rand's work is that it does remain compelling for a reason. Whether or not I think Ayn Rand's a good writer, and there are many people like Stephen King and probably myself included, who would say that her writing is very deeply flawed, it still remains compelling, and especially to a specific demographic of people at a very specific point in their lives. And that's very relevant to consider because it does work. You can work with this concept. You can work with this concept to the degree you can riff on it. And I think that, from what you're telling me, is what Bioshock the first is about.
Mm-hmm.
The second, I have less of a feel on, but I feel like the second, because the second isn't...
The second just continues on. Bioshock 2 is different from Infinite. Bioshock 2 is also in Rapture and continues on those same themes.
Oh, okay.
It kind of just expands upon them. It doesn't do anything as notable as the first, though.
Oh, okay.
It's more
Infinite
just clarifying. New. But Infinite is like, I think, the one that fails to say something new, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think like given the concept we've outlined about there's a great man, builds something, someone's there to stop him. No matter how you present that, like, you can view that from either side of this.
Yeah.
And say, okay, there's a thing, because it depends on who you sympathize with. Now, the games sympathize very plainly with the person going against it in both cases.
Mm-hmm.
With Rapture, you're dealing with a failure because you're dealing with Andrew Ryan and to an extent Ayn Rand's ideas brought to the logical conclusion, which I think would be accurate. I think that Ayn Rand's ideas, like if Galt's Gulch properly existed, not least because of the people who would find it an alluring prospect, you would deal with a enclave full of people fucking and killing each other at very, very
yeah.
Which I'm assuming happens because you have psychic drugs that turns your arm into Vespids.
Yeah. Yep.
I imagine that would probably expedite the process a little bit. The Comstock dystopia is one that like did technically exist more so than Galt's Gulch did, but also that doesn't need to decay. Like the Comstock dystopia, when it works, is really fucking obnoxious and stupid, where it isn't outright venal and terrifying.
Yeah.
Because that's another thing. Anthony Comstock in history and otherwise, you can talk about George Bernard Shaw, Emma Goldman, H.L. Mencken. A large number of people noticed this and commented on it. This is a very dumb way like a dumb and schlocky way to run your society. But this is still the person who can decide to a degree whether or not you can go to prison or worse, which is a unique kind of humiliation and rage that I actually think Ayn Rand would have kind of hated. Like, I think that there are ways where the intention kind of behind creating Rapture or creating, Christian Ethno State in the Sky I think that that does fit into the framework, but I think that the specific person Ayn Rand was, and I think a lot of her actual aesthetics would not have been at home in this place,
Mhm.
in a Comstock world. She would have hated it.
Yeah.
And I think it's very interesting to note that, because that really does kind of cement this as an anthology, because the concept can evolve. Now, I've never played either game, but this is the impression I'm getting, and I find it very compelling, because this is very interesting.
It is a very compelling concept for an anthology, and that's why I'm excited to see where they go next. Because I think they hit it with the first one, and they didn't hit it with Infinite. But I think they can hit it again if they do something new. Basically, with games as a critique, a large part of the problem comes from the fact that these games are funded by billionaires, basically. Like Bioshock is published by 2K, which is a hugely rich company, right? And so I think a lot of any criticism they will make will end up being softened by producers and by boards and that kind of thing, right? So I would be interested to see, and this is kind of what Prey does, and what I think the original System Shock games on which Bioshock was based, what they did, and what I'm hoping the upcoming System Shock 3 will do as well, is that because they are more independently produced and funded, they can say something more real. They can name their target, right? Like Bioshock 1 does. Whereas Bioshock Infinite tries to name its target but fails because it's not specific enough, and because it tries to take this both sides angle, like I said before. When you're making a critique, you have to be clear about what you're actually criticizing.
That's very interesting to me. That it's harder to tell you. It's easier to say Ayn Rand was a shithead than Anthony Comstock was a shithead.
Well, it's not just that either. It's that what Infinite tries to say is that essentially this society leads to everyone being corrupted. That there are no good people left in it. Essentially.
Yes. I find this interesting because, there is a very real historical sense that Comstock society, like, it did survive beyond him.
Yeah.
Comstock was a man of his time. He wasn't exceptional. He was just fervent, I suppose. Ayn Rand, in a lot of ways, mostly idiosyncratic, but some of them, I don't want to say visionary because it's not exactly it, but at least kind of as an artist, at least as brand of propagandist he legitimately was a talented artist. Like, I think that there is a way that, like, people still read The Fountainhead. People still read Atlas Shrugged. Atlas Shrugged is a book that is about 600 pages too long, and people will still read it and get joy out of it. They'll get joy and an ethos out of it.
Yeah.
That tells you something about the ability of the person who wrote it to create art. And it's very interesting to me that where you have the Randian idea, is in this very debased and violent form. The Comstockian idea is the one that is in strapping form, probably actually the most salubrious form it's been in, because Comstock was an incredibly frustrated man, probably because I imagine he felt like a fire hydrant most of the time. And that idea, I mean, that's interesting, because I think that is a very ambitious idea, and I'm sorry to hear that it kind of falls on its face, but
I agree. Yeah, it has a ton of potential.
there's that element of it, because there is, I mean, when we think about the Victorians, it really is there. When we think about Rand doesn't really fit the same way. She's tried to. I mean, that her philosophy has made those inroads.
Mm-hmm.
But I find that very interesting. I've been very curious there, Eric. I legitimately did not know this.
Yeah, it's a very rich work. I think either way, even when it fails, I think it's still a rich work to discuss, and it has been discussed at length in the kind of broader cultural conversation. We're bordering on an hour now, so why don't we wrap up? Why don't you give me your elevator pitch? What is Bioshock?
Well, so we started by remarking that this is a Hegelian synthesis. So I feel like it is a cyclical work that makes you accomplish a synthesis. As you've said, the point is, there is a great man. He builds something, and then someone shall break it down. You, good sir, oh, that man. Now you, sir, you gotta hop on the console there, and then you gotta go out and gotta pick up that, what's the weapon in the game real quick?
I don't know, wrench.
You gotta pick up that wrench there, and then you gotta smash that man, and that psychic drug out his head in, and you gotta smash his head in before his arm turns into a wasp, and he mobs you there with it. There you go, then you gotta go do that, and you gotta make sure that this city doesn't sink under the water, as it's only ever sunk under the water, so you gotta be real careful about it. Sound good? Alright, happy playing.
I feel like maybe 25% of that was audible.
Yeah, I went too hard on it. I mean, I've been hitting about the same amount of rye that a broadcaster from that period would have been doing, so I don't
Sure.
went wrong. But I think my enunciation got ahead of me.
That's all right.
Short, young man, we're saying this to you. Don't do the psychic drugs that turn your appendages into insects. Believe me, it's not worth it in the long run. You're trying to get a cup of coffee and suddenly you sting your wife all over her face. Don't do it. It's a terrible idea.
I like it.
Yeah, it's pretty good encapsulation.
I think so. Yeah. Do you know what the gameplay is like? I feel like you didn't include that in there.
Oh yeah, well, I think
Smashing things with wrenches, I guess. Yeah.
things with wrenches. Yeah, I
Yeah.
feel like, and then turning your arm into insects. I feel like the turning your arm into insects is really sticking with me because that is pretty horrifying.
Yeah, it is. It's very, very, very horrifying, but very cool. I love body horror as like player empowerment. I think it's neat to have an element of disgust to using your most powerful abilities. You know that like in order to kill an enemy, you have to do something disturbing to yourself. That's a neat concept.
Makes me think of Elizabeth Sandifer. Interesting. Okay. Uh, yeah, I think that's the episode. I think we've got that down.
Excellent.
It's
Well,
fascinating, Eric. I think this is our longest episode yet.
it is. Yeah. Well, bye everybody. I hope you had a good time.
Cheers, everyone. Remember, don't do your second drugs unless you're underwater.
See you next time.
Cheers.